At Thanksgiving, my aunt announced, "Everyone should know what your grandmother really left you." My grandmother died 6 months ago. Aunt Lisa was named executor of the will, but every time I called to ask about it, she'd dodge my questions. "These things take time," she'd say before hanging up. Now it was Thanksgiving, and the whole family was crammed into my parents' dining room. Aunt Lisa kept making these little comments all through dinner. Some people are so entitled these days. Young people think money just falls from the sky. Greed runs in families, I suppose. My cousins stared at their plates. Uncle Mark tried changing the subject to football. My mom shot Aunt Lisa warning looks that she completely ignored. Then Aunt Lisa stood up with her wine glass like she was about to make a toast. The whole table went quiet. "Everyone should know what your grandmother really left you," Aunt Lisa said, looking right at me. Her eyes got all watery. $200,000. And this child, she pointed her index at me, has been calling me constantly, demanding to know where it is. My face went hot. Everyone was staring at me now. "I understand you're young and excited about money," Aunt Lisa continued, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "But some of us are dealing with real problems." "Lisa, no need," my mom started. "No, let me finish." Aunt Lisa's voice cracked. "My husband needs emergency surgery." Uncle Mark nodded uncomfortably beside her, looking down at his feet like he was forcing himself to stay quiet for some reason. "Our daughter's college fund is empty. We're about to lose our house," Aunt Lisa said through tears. My stomach twisted into knots. I hadn't known any of that. My mom instinctively reached over and squeezed my hand. "We didn't want to drop this on you during Thanksgiving, but since you brought it up first, we figured it would be best to tell the truth." The guilt and embarrassment I felt made me completely miss that Lisa brought the will up first, not me. "I would never ask this," Aunt Lisa said, more tears forming now. "But if you could just be patient about the money while we figure out our medical bills." She looked around the table. "Your grandmother would want family to help family, wouldn't she?" My uncle nodded. My cousins nodded. Even my dad looked at me like I was being selfish. Suddenly, my college tuition fees and late rent payment notices didn't seem that important anymore. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down to see a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Attorney Grimes, your grandmother's lawyer. Are you at dinner? Call me now." My palms started sweating as I awkwardly stood up. "I need to make a call." As I excused myself from the table, my cousin grabbed my arm and whispered, "My mom, Lisa, bought a new Mercedes for herself last month." I froze. "What? And my dad's surgery?" She glanced back at the table. "That was over a year ago. Insurance covered it." My brows furrowed. I walked into the backyard trying to process what I'd just been told, and my hands shook as I dialed the number. Attorney Grimes answered on the first ring. "Thank God you called," he said. "Are you alone?" "Yeah, I'm in the backyard." "What's going on?" "Your Aunt Lisa has been liquidating your grandmother's estate assets for months. I've been trying to reach you, but she told me you changed your number." My legs felt weak. "What do you mean, liquidating?" "The inheritance was supposed to be $600,000, but she spent $400,000 of it already." I gripped the fence. "On what? Her husband's surgery? The house?" "No." His voice got hard. "A new Mercedes. A down payment on a vacation home in Florida. Liposuction. Designer shopping sprees. I have all the receipts." I couldn't breathe. Aunt Lisa said she just went on a diet. "But she just told everyone about surgery, about—" "I know what she told everyone." The lawyer cut me off. "Your cousin just informed me. That's exactly why I'm calling you." He paused. "Your grandmother was a smart woman. She anticipated this might happen." "What do you mean?" I asked, a mix of curiosity and disbelief in my voice. "She left a sealed letter with me when she wrote the will. Instructions to run a full audit if the estate assets seemed unusually low. I opened it this morning. And? The audit is ongoing, but so far it's damning." His voice then softened. "I'm sorry, but in all likelihood your aunt is being charged with embezzlement. All her assets will likely be frozen pending criminal investigation." I thanked him and hung up. I stared through the window at Aunt Lisa laughing with everyone, probably about how they'd just fooled me. I walked back to the dining room. Lisa suddenly dabbed her eyes with a napkin again. Everyone looked up at me at once, waiting for me to apologize. They clearly had no idea what was coming. "You were right about one thing," I started, looking around at everyone who'd made me feel like garbage my whole life. "I am entitled. Legally entitled." The glances in the room changed to panicked confusion. "Grandma was a lot smarter than you realize." My eyes narrowed on Lisa. "She saw you coming even from her grave." I grabbed my coat off the back of my chair. "See you all in court." I started walking out, knowing I'd started a war I didn't know if I could handle. I pushed through the front door and the cold air hit my face hard. My hands fumbled with my car keys and I dropped them twice on the driveway before finally getting the door open. The engine turned over and I just sat there gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My hands would not stop shaking. I kept hearing Attorney Grimes's voice in my head saying $400,000 over and over. Vacation homes, plastic surgery, $400,000 that should have been mine. I needed to get somewhere private where I could think without Aunt staring at me through the window. I backed out of the driveway faster than I should have and drove straight to my apartment across town. The whole drive I kept replaying Aunt's performance at dinner. The fake tears, the lies about Uncle's surgery. Everyone nodding along like I was the bad guy for asking about my own inheritance. I pulled into my parking spot and ran up the stairs to my apartment. The second I closed the door behind me, I pulled out my phone and called Attorney Grimes back. He picked up on the first ring. He asked if I was somewhere safe to talk, and his voice sounded even more serious than before. My stomach dropped hearing the worry in his tone. I told him I was alone in my apartment, and he started walking me through everything he found in the audit. He had receipts for the Mercedes my cousin mentioned, a down payment on a vacation condo in Florida, multiple cosmetic procedures at some fancy clinic, designer shopping trips to New York. Each thing he listed felt like getting slapped across the face. The numbers were huge. Thousands and thousands of dollars on clothes and furniture and trips. All of it spent while I was calling Aunt every week asking when I could get money for tuition. Attorney Grimes kept talking, and I realized my grandmother had been so smart. She knew this might happen. She planned for it with that sealed letter. Without her instructions to run an audit, I would never have found out the truth. Aunt would have just kept lying and spending until everything was gone. I was still on the phone when my roommate came home and found me crying at the kitchen table. I had printed out some of the documents Attorney Grimes emailed me, and they were spread all over the table. My roommate took one look at my face and went to make tea without asking questions. When she came back with 2 mugs, I explained everything. How Aunt stole my inheritance. How she humiliated me at Thanksgiving in front of everyone. How $400,000 was just gone on stupid luxury stuff. My roommate listened to the whole story and then immediately told me not to worry about utilities this month. She said I could skip my share until things got sorted out. I almost started crying again because she was being so nice. My phone buzzed on the table and I saw a text from my mom. It said, "Please come back and work this out like family." Reading that message made me so angry. She sat there at dinner and watched Aunt perform her whole sob story. She squeezed my hand like she felt bad for me, but she never once spoke up. She never once told Aunt to stop lying. I typed out a response saying she should have defended me. Then I deleted it. I typed another one asking why she let Aunt humiliate me. Deleted that too. I typed a third response, but my hands were shaking too much, so I just put the phone down. I spent the rest of the night staring at the documents. The next morning, I got up early and started gathering every paper I had related to the estate. The original copy of the will that my grandmother's lawyer mailed me. Printed emails where Aunt kept dodging my questions about timing. My tuition bills with the big red past due stamps. Rent notices from my landlord. I laid everything out on the floor in order by date. Looking at it all together, I could see the pattern so clearly. Every time I asked a direct question, Aunt would say, "These things take time, or I'll get back to you soon." She was stalling, buying herself more time to spend the money before I figured out what was happening. The pattern of delays suddenly made perfect sense. My laptop dinged with a new email from Attorney Grimes. He sent me a detailed list of everything he needed from me. Signed authorization forms so he could request official documents. A written timeline of every time I tried to contact Aunt about the will. My availability for meetings this week. Seeing concrete action steps made me feel slightly less overwhelmed. At least I knew what to do next. I responded to his email within an hour with all the information he asked for. Then I checked my other email and my stomach dropped again. There was a notice from the college saying I had a tuition hold on my account. I could not register for next semester until I paid my outstanding balance in full. I clicked over to my rent payment portal and saw another notice. My rent was officially late as of today. The late fee had already been added to what I owed. $50 on top of the $1,200 I was already behind. My financial situation kept getting worse while Aunt was probably relaxing in her new Mercedes. 2 days went by in a blur of paperwork and stress. Then I had my first video call with Attorney Grimes. He shared his screen and started showing me bank statements from the estate account. The Mercedes cost $68,000. The Florida condo down payment was $90,000. Then there were dozens of smaller charges at luxury stores. $1,500 at some designer handbag place. $3,000 at a furniture store. $800 at a spa. The charges just kept coming and they added up to tens of thousands more. I felt sick watching the numbers scroll past. Attorney Grimes explained he was drafting an emergency petition to freeze all remaining estate assets and remove Aunt as executor. The legal words sounded scary and complicated. Temporary restraining order, breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of funds. But he walked me through each step carefully. He explained how the emergency petition worked, how we would present evidence to the judge, how my grandmother had anticipated exactly this situation in her sealed letter. He kept assuring me we had a strong case. He said my grandmother had been smart enough to build in protections. Hearing him explain the plan made me feel like maybe I could actually win this fight. I grabbed my phone and pulled up my cousin's number. My hands were still shaking a little from everything attorney had just told me, but I needed to hear this directly from her. I typed out a quick message asking if she could talk privately and hit send before I could second-guess myself. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately showing she was typing back. She said she could call me in about an hour once she got to her car. I spent that hour pacing around my apartment trying not to think about Aunt sitting at that Thanksgiving table, probably laughing about how she fooled everyone. My phone finally rang and I answered on the first ring. My cousin's voice was quiet and nervous, like she was worried someone might hear her, even though she said she was alone in her car. She told me her mom bought the Mercedes last month and had been showing it off to relatives. She said Aunt kept talking about the Florida condo too, telling people about the beach view and how great the investment was going to be. But she never once mentioned where the money came from. My cousin said she only connected the dots when attorney called about the will, and she realized the timing matched up perfectly. She apologized for not saying something sooner, but she had been scared of her mom's reaction. I told her I understood and thanked her for finally telling me the truth. After we hung up, I felt this weird mix of validation and anger. At least I knew I wasn't crazy for being suspicious. My mom called later that evening. I almost didn't answer, but I knew avoiding her would just make things worse. She started talking before I could even say hello, asking if we could work this out in the family without getting lawyers involved. Her voice had that pleading tone she uses when she wants me to just go along with something to keep the peace. I told her that Aunt already involved lawyers by stealing from me, and this wasn't something we could just talk through over coffee. There was this long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, my mom said she just wanted everyone to get along. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, but I also felt frustrated that she still wasn't really taking my side. She was trying to play mediator when what I needed was for someone to be angry with me about what Aunt had done. We ended the call without really resolving anything, and I felt even more alone than before. The next morning, I woke up to 17 notifications on my phone. Aunt had sent a group text to the whole family. I opened it and my face immediately got hot reading her words. She wrote that I stormed out of Thanksgiving in a tantrum and was making wild accusations instead of being patient during a difficult time. She made it sound like I was some spoiled kid throwing a fit over having to wait for my inheritance. The message was clearly designed to make everyone think I was the problem. I read it 3 times and each time I got angrier. I started typing out a response explaining about the Mercedes and the condo and all the receipts attorney had found. My fingers were flying across the keyboard listing out every lie she had told. But then I stopped myself and just sat there with my hands shaking. I wanted so badly to defend myself and tell everyone the truth. Instead, I sat on my hands literally to keep from hitting send. I made myself put the phone down and walk away from it. 10 minutes later, attorney called me. He said he saw I forwarded him the group text and wanted to talk to me right away. He told me not to respond publicly no matter how tempting it was. He explained that Aunt was trying to control the narrative and get the family on her side before the legal stuff started. Any response from me could be used against us later in court. He said I needed to let the evidence speak instead of defending myself in a family group chat. It was one of the hardest things he had asked me to do, because staying quiet felt like letting Aunt win. But I understood his point. The court would care about bank statements and receipts, not about who said what in a family text message. He told me we were filing the emergency petition on Friday, and that would be my real response to Aunt's lies. Friday afternoon finally came and I met attorney at the courthouse. We filed the emergency petition with the probate court, and I watched him hand over this thick stack of papers to the clerk. Everything felt very official and real in a way that made my stomach flip. Attorney explained that a process server would deliver the papers to Aunt at her house within the next few hours. I tried to imagine what that would be like for her, answering the door and getting handed legal documents. Part of me felt guilty for a second, but then I remembered the $400,000 she had spent on herself. A few hours later, attorney texted me a photo of the signed proof of service. Seeing that official stamp and signature made everything feel suddenly very real. I felt this surge of power knowing I had actually done something concrete to fight back. But mixed with that was pure terror about what would happen next. Aunt would know now that I wasn't backing down, and I had no idea how she would react. Monday morning, I had an appointment at the financial aid office. I walked into the building with all my documentation in a folder and asked for Reese McCarthy. She was this woman in her 40s with kind eyes who listened carefully while I explained my situation. I showed her the court filing and the notices about my tuition hold. She reviewed everything quietly and asked a few questions about the timeline. Then she told me about an emergency hardship fund that might cover part of my tuition, while the legal case was pending. The relief I felt was huge, but she also warned me I would need to provide updates as things progressed. She said the fund was meant for temporary situations, and I would need to show I was actively working toward resolving my financial problems. I promised her I would keep her updated and signed all the forms she gave me. I walked directly from the financial aid office to my landlord's office on the other side of campus. Hunter McCarthy was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 30s, and he seemed pretty relaxed when I explained why I was there. I told him about my late rent and showed him the court filing and attorney's contact information. He read through the documents while I sat there nervously picking at my fingernail. Finally, he looked up and said he could work with me on a payment plan with reduced late fees if I could catch up within 90 days. I almost cried right there in his office. He printed out a new payment schedule and I signed it immediately. Walking out of that building, I felt like maybe things were starting to look up a little bit. Then 2 days later, attorney forwarded me a letter from Aunt's lawyer. The legal language was really aggressive and dismissive in a way that made me angry all over again. The letter denied all wrongdoing and claimed every expense was necessary for estate administration and family welfare. It made Aunt sound like some kind of hero who was just trying to take care of everyone. Attorney called me right after he sent it because he knew I would be upset. He talked me down from my anger by reminding me that desperate people make loud noises. He said the aggressive tone actually showed that Aunt's lawyer knew they were in trouble, and were trying to intimidate us into backing off. That helped a little, but I still felt frustrated by how unfair the whole thing was. Attorney scheduled a longer meeting with me later that week to talk about realistic expectations. He explained that probate cases typically take months to resolve, and even with our strong evidence, I shouldn't expect quick results. He walked me through timelines for hearings and asset recovery and potential criminal charges. He made sure I understood this would be a marathon, rather than a sprint. Hearing that was hard because I needed money now for tuition and rent, not months from now. But I appreciated that he was being honest with me instead of making promises he couldn't keep. He said the emergency petition might speed things up a little bit, but the court system just moved slowly no matter what. The sealed letter from my grandmother became the centerpiece of our case. Attorney showed me the actual letter during one of our meetings, and I read my grandmother's handwriting explaining her instructions. She had explicitly written that if the estate value dropped significantly, attorney should investigate her executor for taking money that wasn't theirs. She used words like misappropriation and fiduciary duty that sounded very official and legal, but then at the end she wrote something more personal about wanting to make sure her granddaughter's future was protected. Reading those words felt like getting a hug from beyond the grave. I started crying right there in attorney's office because I realized my grandmother had seen this coming. She knew Aunt might try something and she built in protections to catch her. She had tried to protect me even after death, and that meant everything to me. The next morning, I woke up to a notification on my phone that made my stomach drop. One of my cousins had posted on social media with a photo from Thanksgiving dinner showing everyone smiling around the table. The caption read something about how sad it is when family members tear families apart over money, and how some people care more about greed than relationships. I scrolled through the comments looking for anyone who might defend me or at least question the story, but there was nothing. Just a bunch of heart emojis and supportive comments from relatives I barely knew. The isolation hit me harder than I expected, because I realized that to everyone else in my family, I was the villain in this story. They all believed Aunt's performance about medical bills and desperate circumstances, and nobody was going to give me the benefit of the doubt. I sat there staring at my phone for probably 20 minutes before I reminded myself that being right mattered more than being popular with people who didn't even know the full truth. Attorney called me later that morning to tell me he was filing a motion with the court requesting forensic accounting and subpoenas for Aunt's bank records. I asked him what would happen if she had hidden money in other accounts or transferred it somewhere we couldn't find, and he explained that forensic accountants were specially trained to find exactly those kinds of transfers. He said they could trace money through multiple accounts and even find assets that had been hidden or moved around to avoid detection. That made me feel a little better because it meant we had professionals who knew how to catch people trying to hide things. Around lunchtime, my cousin texted me asking if we could talk privately, and when I called her, she sent me screenshots of text messages from months ago. The messages showed Aunt telling different relatives that the estate was smaller than expected, and that legal fees were eating up everything. Some of the messages were from back in July, which was only a month after my grandmother died. I felt sick reading them because it proved she had been lying to everyone for a long time, not just at Thanksgiving. She had been building this narrative for months that there wasn't much money left, so nobody would question her when she finally had to tell the truth about how much she had spent. My mom texted me that afternoon asking if we could meet for coffee at a neutral location, and I agreed, even though I wasn't sure what to expect. When we sat down at the coffee shop, she looked completely exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. She admitted she was caught between her sister and her daughter, and didn't know what to do or who to believe. I told her as gently as I could that this wasn't about choosing sides between people. It was about right and wrong. I showed her some of the documents attorney had sent me, including receipts for the Mercedes and the Florida condo. She stared at the papers for a long time without saying anything, and I could see her trying to process that her sister had actually stolen from her own niece. A few days later, attorney called to tell me the court had set a preliminary hearing date 3 weeks away to consider our emergency motion for a temporary asset freeze. He explained that if the judge granted it, Aunt wouldn't be able to spend any more money while the investigation continued. He said this would be a big first victory because it would stop the bleeding and prevent her from spending whatever was left. I marked the date on my calendar and felt this mix of hope and anxiety about what would happen at the hearing. That same evening, I got a long email from Aunt that made me so angry I had to put my phone down and walk away. The email claimed that Uncle really did need surgery and they were about to lose their house, and she had only spent the money because she was desperate and didn't know what else to do. She wrote about how hard things had been and how she never meant to hurt anyone. I forwarded the whole thing to attorney without responding, because I knew if I replied, I would say something I regretted. He called me right after and pointed out that her story kept changing. First it was current medical bills, and now it was past desperation, and the inconsistency actually helped our case. The next day, I had an appointment at the financial aid office with Reese, who handled hardship cases. I brought all my documentation, including the court filings and attorney's contact information. She reviewed everything carefully and told me they could approve a conditional short-term deferment that would cover half my tuition until the end of the semester. She warned me that I would need to show progress on resolving my financial situation by January, or the deferment would end and I would owe the full amount. I thanked her probably 5 times because it meant I could stay enrolled while the legal case moved forward. Later that week, I met with my landlord Hunter to discuss my late rent situation. I had prepared a written proposal for a payment plan and brought copies of the court documents to prove this wasn't just an excuse. He looked over my proposal and agreed to accept it with one change. He would waive half the late fees since I had provided proper documentation of my legal situation. I almost cried right there in his office because I had been so worried he would evict me. Walking out of that building, I felt like maybe things were starting to look up a little bit. Then 2 days later, attorney forwarded me a letter from Aunt's lawyer. The legal language was really aggressive and dismissive in a way that made me angry all over again. The letter denied all wrongdoing and claimed every expense was necessary for estate administration and family welfare. It made Aunt sound like some kind of hero who was just trying to take care of everyone. Attorney called me right after he sent it because he knew I would be upset. He talked me down from my anger by reminding me that desperate people make loud noises. He said the aggressive tone actually showed that Aunt's lawyer knew they were in trouble and were trying to scare us into backing off. A week before the hearing, attorney forwarded me a preliminary report from the forensic accountant Patrick. The report showed that Patrick had traced transfers to a cosmetic surgery clinic totaling $32,000. The dates matched up with when Aunt claimed she had been on a diet and lost weight naturally. I felt physically sick knowing she had gotten liposuction with money my grandmother had left specifically for my education. Attorney said this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed because it showed luxury spending that had nothing to do with family welfare or estate administration. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep, so I got up and started writing out a timeline of everything that had happened. I listed every phone call where Aunt dodged my questions, every lie she told at Thanksgiving, every document attorney had found. Seeing it all laid out in front of me, 6 months of delays and lies and manipulation, made me feel less crazy for being this angry. I had questioned myself, so many times wondering if I was overreacting or being greedy like Aunt said. But looking at the timeline, I realized I had every right to be upset and to fight for what my grandmother wanted me to have. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m, feeling more prepared than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing on the nightstand. My mom had sent a text that just said, "Good luck today," with no other words about whose side she was on or what she thought about the whole situation. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out if it meant she believed me or if she was just being polite. The gesture made me feel a little less alone, even though I really wished she would just say she supported me. I checked my other messages, hoping my dad had sent something too, but there was nothing from him. That silence hurt worse than anything, because it felt like he had already picked Aunt's side without even hearing the full story. I got dressed in the nicest clothes I owned and tried not to think about how my hands were shaking while I buttoned my shirt. Attorney called at 8 to confirm I was ready, and told me to meet him at the courthouse steps at 9:30. The drive there felt like it took forever, even though it was only 15 minutes. I kept rehearsing in my head what I might have to say if the judge asked me questions directly. The hearing itself went by really fast, but every minute felt super intense. Attorney presented all our evidence while I sat behind him in the gallery, trying not to make eye contact with Aunt, who was sitting across the aisle with her lawyer. The judge looked through the bank statements and receipts that showed the Mercedes purchase and the Florida condo down payment. Aunt's lawyer stood up and argued that everything she spent was needed for estate management and taking care of family members during a difficult time. His voice sounded really confident, like he actually believed what he was saying. Attorney responded by pointing to the sealed letter from my grandmother and the forensic accounting report that proved the spending had nothing to do with estate business. The judge asked a few questions about specific transactions and then announced he was granting a temporary asset freeze on all remaining estate funds. He also said he was appointing Becca as a neutral administrator to take over from Aunt until everything got sorted out. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt this weird mix of being right about everything, but also completely drained from watching Aunt glare at me the whole time. Her eyes looked angry in a way that made my stomach hurt, even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. Aunt stormed out ahead of us, and I watched her yank her phone out of her purse before she even got to her car. 5 minutes later, my phone started going crazy with notifications. She had started a family group chat and was already typing paragraph after paragraph about how the judge was clearly biased and how I was destroying the family over greed. Messages started pouring in from relatives I barely knew. Some of them were asking what happened, while others were already taking sides without knowing any facts. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Uncle sent a message saying the whole thing was a misunderstanding. One of my other cousins wrote that I should have just waited patiently like Aunt asked. My phone kept buzzing over and over until my hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold it. I opened the settings and muted the whole chat because I couldn't handle reading any more messages about how I was the bad guy in this situation. Attorney called me the next afternoon and asked if I could come to his office to talk about what happens from here. I drove over right after my last class and found him sitting at his desk with a bunch of legal documents spread out in front of him. He explained that our next step was filing a motion to permanently remove Aunt as executor, since the temporary freeze was only good for 30 days. He also said he was going to recommend referring the case to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges. The word criminal made everything feel suddenly very real and scary in a way it hadn't before. I asked him what that meant exactly, and he said Aunt could potentially face charges for embezzlement and breach of her legal duty as executor. He told me the decision about criminal prosecution wasn't up to us, but the evidence was strong enough that the DA would probably want to investigate. I sat there trying to process that my aunt might actually go to jail over this, and feeling sick about it even though I knew she deserved consequences for what she did. A few days later, attorney forwarded me the complete forensic report from Patrick. I opened the file and started reading through page after page of bank transactions and account transfers. About halfway through, I found something that made me stop breathing for a second. The report showed that Aunt had transferred $75,000 to Uncle's business account last year. The date was right around when she first became executor of the will. Attorney called me right after he sent the report because he knew I would have questions. He explained that this transfer meant Uncle was either in on the whole thing from the start, or he knew about the money and chose not to ask where it came from. Either way, it was more proof that Aunt had deliberately taken money that wasn't hers, and used it for personal stuff that had nothing to do with managing the estate properly. My phone rang that evening and I saw it was my cousin calling. When I answered, she was already crying. So hard I could barely understand what she was saying. She kept apologizing and saying she was scared about what would happen to her mom, but she also knew her mom had done something really wrong. I told her that telling the truth didn't make her a bad daughter, and that sometimes loving someone means holding them responsible when they mess up. We talked for over an hour about how families can care about each other and still admit when someone has crossed a line. She told me she felt guilty for warning me about the Mercedes at Thanksgiving, because now her mom might face criminal charges. I reminded her that her mom's choices were what caused this mess, not her honesty about what was happening. By the end of the call, she seemed a little calmer, and I felt glad that at least one person in the family understood why I had to fight back. 2 days later, I got an email from Becca asking for copies of any estate-related documents I had. She needed everything I could find, including the original will, any letters from my grandmother, and all my email exchanges with Aunt about the inheritance. I spent that whole evening scanning papers and organizing files on my computer. My roommate brought me coffee while I worked and asked if I was doing okay. The process of gathering everything and sending it to the administrator made me feel like I was taking back some control over a situation that had felt completely out of my hands for months. Every document I scanned was proof that I had been asking reasonable questions and that Aunt had been dodging them the whole time. A week after the hearing, a letter arrived from Aunt's lawyer with a proposal for family mediation. The letter had all this language about keeping things private and avoiding more legal costs that would eat up what was left of the estate. It talked about how mediation would be better for everyone and help us resolve things without destroying family relationships. For a few minutes, I actually felt tempted by the idea of just ending this whole nightmare quickly. I was so tired of the constant stress and the family drama and having to think about legal stuff all the time. I called attorney to ask what he thought about the mediation offer. Attorney listened to me read the whole letter and then said mediation could work, but only if Aunt agreed to provide complete financial disclosure first. He explained that mediation was pointless if she was still hiding assets or lying about where money went. He sent a response to her lawyer saying we would consider mediation only after receiving full documentation of every estate transaction. Her lawyer wrote back refusing that condition and saying we were being unreasonable. Attorney called me after he got that response and said the refusal proved Aunt was definitely still hiding something. I felt relieved that he wasn't going to let me get talked into a bad deal just because I was exhausted and wanted it to be over. The legal case kept dragging on, and I needed money to cover my regular expenses while we waited for everything to get resolved. I picked up extra shifts at my campus job working in the library. Some weeks I was pulling 25 hours on top of my full class schedule. The exhaustion was really intense, especially when I had to go straight from work to meetings with attorney or court appearances. Balancing classes and work and constant legal stuff felt impossible most days. But staying busy actually helped keep me from spiraling into panic about money or obsessing over what relatives were saying about me. Every shift I worked was money I earned myself that nobody could take away or lie about or use to manipulate me. That felt important somehow even when I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open during lectures. A week later, attorney called and asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. I walked into his conference room and he had a single piece of paper sitting on the table between us. He slid it across to me and explained, this was the sealed letter my grandmother left with her will. I picked it up with shaking hands and started reading her handwriting. She wrote that she loved me and wanted to make sure I could finish college without debt. She mentioned worrying about Aunt's spending habits over the years and wanting protections in place if anything seemed wrong with the estate. The part that broke me was where she wrote about my granddaughter's future and how important it was that I got the education she never had. I started crying right there in his office and couldn't stop for several minutes. Attorney pushed a box of tissues across the table and waited quietly while I pulled myself together. Reading her exact words made me feel like she was still looking out for me even though she was gone. I felt grateful and sad at the same time knowing she'd been worried enough to plan for this exact situation. 2 days after that meeting, I got a call from an unknown number. A woman named Danielle introduced herself as a prosecutor from the district attorney's office. She explained they were looking into potential criminal charges against Aunt and wanted to interview me as part of their preliminary investigation. My stomach started doing flips, knowing this meant criminal charges were actually being considered. Danielle said the interview was just to gather information and determine if charges were warranted. She scheduled me to come in the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I thanked her and hung up feeling sick about the idea of testifying against my aunt in a criminal case. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else instead of living through it myself. Tuesday morning came and I sat across from Danielle in a small interview room at the courthouse. She had a recording device on the table and a thick folder full of documents. She started asking me questions about specific dates when I called Aunt asking about the inheritance. She wanted to know exactly what Aunt told me each time and how she explained the delays. I walked through the whole timeline starting from 6 months ago when my grandmother died. Danielle asked about the Thanksgiving dinner and what Aunt said about needing money for medical bills and potentially losing the house. I explained how she made me feel guilty for even asking about my inheritance. Danielle kept her questions really factual and unemotional, which actually helped me stay calm. Every time I felt myself getting upset about the family betrayal, I focused on the documents in front of me instead. I managed to get through the whole interview without crying by treating it like a school exam, rather than talking about my aunt stealing from me. That same afternoon, I checked my phone and saw a Facebook message from an older relative I barely knew. She was my grandmother's cousin, and we'd only met a few times at family events. Her message said she believed me and thought Aunt had been irresponsible with money for years. She wrote that other family members were too scared to speak up, but she wanted me to know someone supported me. It was the first time anyone from the extended family had publicly broken ranks and taken my side. The validation steadied me in a way I didn't expect. I'd been feeling completely alone in this fight, and suddenly someone else was willing to say out loud that Aunt was wrong. Later that week, Uncle sent me a private message on Facebook. He wrote that he was sorry for how things have gone and hoped we could all move past this eventually. I read through his message 3 times looking for any actual admission that he knew about the stolen money. He never said it directly. His careful wording made me angry because he was clearly trying to seem sympathetic without taking any responsibility. He'd benefited from Aunt's theft just as much as she had. The money went into their joint accounts and paid for things they both used. His apology felt hollow and calculated, like he was trying to protect himself legally, while still seeming like a good guy. A few days after that, Becca called me with an update. She'd located the documentation for the Florida condo down payment and discovered the property was in Aunt's and Uncle's names jointly. She explained that recovering that money would be really complicated since it was tied up in real estate now. The best-case scenario was that we might get back a portion of what was spent depending on the property value and how much they still owed on it. I asked if that meant some of the money was just gone forever. Becca said probably yes, but we'd fight for whatever we could recover. The conversation left me feeling defeated because even if we won the legal case, I wasn't getting back everything that was stolen. My mom texted me the next morning asking if I wanted to come to dinner on Sunday to smooth things over. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I wrote back that I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine, while Aunt still hadn't admitted what she did or faced any real consequences. My mom called me right away, and I could hear the stress in her voice. She said the family was falling apart and everyone was miserable. I told her gently that Aunt was the one who made this mess by stealing from me and lying about it. Smoothing things over wasn't going to fix the actual problem. My mom went quiet for a minute and then said she understood, but wished there was another way. I said I wished that too, but there wasn't. Attorney scheduled a long meeting the following week to prepare for the executor removal hearing. I sat in his conference room for 3 hours while we reviewed witness lists and organized exhibits. He had copies of every bank statement and receipt that Patrick had traced during the forensic accounting. We practiced how I would answer questions if I had to testify. Attorney asked me the same questions over and over until I could answer them clearly without getting emotional. The preparation was boring and tedious, but I felt more confident by the end, knowing we had a solid case. Attorney explained the hearing would probably take most of a day, and I should plan to be there the whole time, even if I didn't end up testifying. The removal hearing started at 9 in the morning, and the courtroom was almost empty except for the lawyers and court staff. Attorney presented the sealed letter from my grandmother first, and the judge read through it carefully. Then Patrick took the stand and walked through his forensic accounting findings. He had charts and spreadsheets showing every transaction Aunt made with estate money. Aunt's lawyer tried to argue that mistakes weren't crimes and that his client had acted in good faith. He said the estate administration was complicated, and Aunt had done her best under difficult circumstances. I sat in the gallery barely breathing while the judge asked Patrick questions about specific purchases. The judge wanted to know if there was any legitimate estate purpose for the Mercedes or the Florida condo. Patrick said no based on his analysis of the transactions. The judge took a short break and came back 20 minutes later with his decision. He said there was clear evidence of misappropriation and breach of fiduciary duty. He removed Aunt as executor immediately and appointed Becca as the permanent administrator of the estate. The relief I felt hearing those words was overwhelming, and I had to grip the bench to keep from shaking. But watching Aunt's face crumple as she realized she'd lost control also made me sad. She looked smaller somehow sitting next to her lawyer. Part of me still remembered family dinners and holidays before all this happened. The judge kept talking about next steps and timelines, but I couldn't focus on his words. I just kept thinking that we'd won this part of the fight, but the war was far from over. The judge kept going through his orders while I tried to process what just happened. He said he wanted a full accounting of every single estate transaction going back to when Aunt became executor. Becca would need to submit detailed reports showing where every dollar went and what assets could still be recovered. The judge used the term clawback provisions and explained that Aunt might be required to pay back money she spent even if she didn't have it anymore. My stomach twisted hearing that because it meant the Mercedes and the Florida condo might not be enough to recover everything. Becca met with me in the hallway after the hearing ended and walked me through what the accounting process would look like. She had this calm way of explaining complicated legal stuff that made it easier to understand. She said we'd likely recover some of the missing money, but probably not all of it, depending on what assets Aunt still owned and whether they could be liquidated. The Florida condo had value, but selling real estate takes time, and there might be a mortgage on it that would reduce what we could recover. The Mercedes could be seized and sold, but it would only bring back maybe $40,000 or $50,000 after it depreciated. I asked about the cosmetic surgery money, and Becca just shook her head because you can't exactly repossess liposuction. Walking out of the courthouse that day felt surreal because I'd won this huge battle, but the victory was smaller than I expected. I drove back to my apartment in a daze and sat in my car for 20 minutes before going inside. 2 weeks crawled by while I waited to hear what would happen next. I kept going to classes and working my campus job, but my brain was somewhere else most of the time. My roommate noticed I was distracted and kept asking if I was okay, but I didn't know how to explain that I was waiting to find out if my aunt would be arrested. Then attorney called me on a Wednesday afternoon and told me that Danielle from the district attorney's office had filed criminal charges. The charges were embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty, which sounded serious and official in a way that made my hands shake. Attorney said Aunt would be arrested and would have to post bond before she could be released. I asked what bond meant, and he explained it was basically money to make sure she showed up for court dates. The amount was set at $50,000, which seemed like a lot, but attorney said it was actually pretty standard for this type of crime. Aunt posted bond through a friend the same day she was arrested, so she didn't spend any time in jail. Part of me felt relieved about that because despite everything, she was still family, and the thought of her in a cell made me feel sick. But another part of me was angry that she could just pay her way out while I was still dealing with late rent and tuition holds. The local newspaper ran a small story about the charges 2 days later. Someone sent me a link and I made the mistake of reading it during my lunch break at work. Seeing my grandmother's name in print connected to words like embezzlement and criminal charges made my stomach hurt, even though I knew Aunt deserved consequences. The article was only 4 paragraphs and didn't name me specifically, but anyone who knew our family would know exactly who the victim was. My phone started buzzing with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. Most of them were supportive, but a few made comments about how this didn't need to become public, and couldn't we have handled it privately. I didn't respond to any of them because attorney had told me not to discuss the case with family members. I scheduled another meeting with Reese at the financial aid office to update her on everything that happened. She'd been checking in with me every couple weeks since the first deferment was approved, and she seemed genuinely invested in helping me stay enrolled. I brought copies of the court orders and the criminal charges to show her the case was moving forward. Reese reviewed all the documents carefully and asked questions about the timeline for when estate funds might be released. I told her honestly that I didn't know for sure, but Becca was working on the accounting and things were progressing. Reese pulled up my student account on her computer and started typing notes. She said based on documented legal hardship, she could extend my tuition deferment through the spring semester. The extension meant I could stay enrolled and keep taking classes while waiting for the inheritance money to come through. Relief washed over me hearing those words because I'd been terrified of having to drop out. Reese explained the deferment was conditional, and I'd need to provide updates if anything major changed with the case. She also reminded me that interest would still accrue on any loans I had, but at least I wouldn't be kicked out of school. I thanked her probably 5 times before leaving her office. Walking across campus afterward, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The legal battle was still ongoing and my family was still a mess, but at least I could finish my degree. That same afternoon, I went to Hunter's office to talk about my rent situation. I'd been making small payments when I could, but I was still behind, and the late fees kept piling up. Hunter managed several apartment buildings near campus, and I'd always had a decent relationship with him before all this started. He pulled up my payment history on his computer, and I could see the red marks showing missed payments and accumulated fees. I explained what was happening with the estate case and showed him the same court documents I'd shown Reese. Hunter read through everything and asked a few questions about when I expected to receive money. I told him the same thing I told Reese, which was that I didn't have an exact timeline, but things were moving forward. Hunter leaned back in his chair and thought for a minute. He said he could restructure my catch-up plan to spread the payments over 6 months instead of 3. The late fees would stay on my account because they were already charged, but the longer timeline meant I could actually make the payments without destroying my budget. I did quick math in my head and realized 6 months of smaller payments was way more manageable than 3 months of huge ones. I agreed immediately, and Hunter printed out a new payment agreement for me to sign. He made me promise to communicate with him if anything changed, and not just stop paying without explanation. I promised and meant it because he was being more than fair with me. Leaving his office, I felt another weight lift off my shoulders. My financial situation was still tight, but at least I had a realistic plan for catching up on rent. My mom showed up at my apartment one evening without calling first. I heard the knock and opened the door to find her standing there holding a bag of groceries. She asked if she could come in, and I stepped aside to let her pass. We hadn't talked much since the hearing, except for a few short text exchanges. She unpacked the groceries in my kitchen, which included actual food, and not just ramen and frozen pizza. I sat at my small table and watched her move around my apartment, straightening things that didn't need straightening. Finally, she sat down across from me and said she needed to tell me something. Her voice was quiet, and she looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. She admitted she knew Aunt had spending problems, but didn't think it was this bad. She talked about how Aunt had always been impulsive with money even when they were younger. There were credit card debts and bad financial decisions going back years. Mom said she thought Aunt would be more responsible handling grandmother's estate because it was family money and there were legal requirements. She realized now that was naive and she should have spoken up sooner. I asked why she didn't defend me at Thanksgiving, and her eyes got watery. She said she was trying to keep peace in the family and didn't want to believe her sister could do something so terrible. We talked for over an hour about enabling versus helping, and what it means to support family when they're doing wrong things. Mom said she was proud of me for standing up for myself even though it was hard. She admitted she struggled with setting boundaries with Aunt, and watching me do it made her realize she needed to work on that too. I told her I was still hurt she didn't defend me when Aunt was lying to everyone, but I understood she was in a difficult position. It wasn't a perfect conversation and we didn't fix everything, but it felt like a real honest talk for the first time in months. Mom hugged me before she left and said she'd try to do better. I believed her. My cousin called me a few days later and asked if we could meet for coffee. We picked a place halfway between our apartments and sat in a corner booth away from other people. She looked nervous, stirring her drink and not making eye contact. Finally, she said she wanted to thank me for standing up to her mom. Her voice cracked a little when she said it. She explained that watching someone finally hold Aunt accountable had been both painful and freeing for her. She talked about growing up with a mom who was financially irresponsible and manipulative. There were times when rent didn't get paid, or utilities got shut off because her mom spent money on things they didn't need. Uncle would try to fix it, but he enabled Aunt's behavior by always bailing her out. My cousin said she learned to lie to protect her mom's image, and it became this automatic thing she did without thinking. She felt safer now telling the truth about things because I'd proven that speaking up was possible. I told her I was sorry she grew up dealing with that and I wished I'd known sooner. She said it wasn't my fault, and she was glad the truth finally came out, even though it was messy. We talked about how hard it is to love someone and still acknowledge they're hurting people. My cousin mentioned she'd started seeing a therapist to work through everything, and it was helping. I thought about doing the same thing because this whole situation had definitely messed with my head. We finished our coffee and hugged in the parking lot. My cousin said she'd always have my back no matter what happened with the legal case. That meant more to me than she probably realized. Becca sent me an email with a detailed projection of what I could expect to recover from the estate. I opened it on my laptop and had to read through it twice to understand all the numbers. After legal fees and what could be recovered from Aunt's assets, the projection showed I'd likely receive between $240,000 and $300,000. My heart sank seeing that number because it was less than half of the original $600,000. I called attorney right away, and he walked me through the breakdown. Some of the money Aunt spent was just gone and couldn't be recovered. The cosmetic procedures, the shopping trips, the cash withdrawals that went to who knows what. The Mercedes and the Florida condo had value, but there were loans against both that reduced what we could get back. Legal fees for both the probate case and the criminal case were eating up more of what remained. Attorney reminded me that $240,000 to $300,000 was still a significant amount of money, and we'd fought hard to get even that much back. He said without grandmother's sealed letter and the forensic accounting, we might not have recovered anything. I knew he was right, but it was hard not to feel angry about what Aunt had stolen. That money was supposed to be for my education and my future, and she'd spent it on plastic surgery and vacation homes. I thanked attorney for everything he'd done and hung up feeling deflated. Later that night, I let myself cry about it because holding it in wasn't helping. My roommate heard me and came to check on me. I showed her the projection email and she said $240,000 was still enough to finish school and start my life. She was right, but the loss still hurt. I kept working my campus job over the next few months and slowly paid down my rent like I'd promised Hunter. Each payment was small, but seeing the balance decrease felt like progress. I was taking care of myself even when family let me down, and that mattered. My coworkers didn't know about the legal drama, and I liked having one part of my life that felt normal. I picked up extra shifts when I could and saved every dollar that wasn't going to rent or basic expenses. The routine helped keep me grounded when everything else felt chaotic. Some days I'd be shelving books in the library and forget about the court case for whole hours at a time. Those moments of peace were rare, but I appreciated them. My grades stayed decent despite everything, which felt like a small miracle. Professors didn't know what I was dealing with, and I didn't tell them because I didn't want special treatment. I just wanted to prove I could handle my responsibilities even when life got complicated. Every rent payment felt like a small victory. Every completed assignment felt like proof I was stronger than I thought. The money situation was still tight and the legal case was still ongoing, but I was managing. That had to count for something. Attorney called me in early March with news that Aunt's lawyer had approached him about a plea deal. My stomach dropped hearing those words because I knew what they meant. Aunt would plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a structured plan to pay back what she stole. Attorney explained the details carefully. The charges would be reduced from felony embezzlement to a lesser offense. Aunt would avoid jail time but would be on probation. The plan would require regular payments over several years with interest. Danielle from the DA's office wanted my input on whether I'd support the deal. I sat there holding my phone, not knowing what to say. Part of me wanted Aunt to face the full consequences of what she did. She'd lied to everyone, stolen from family, and tried to make me look like the bad guy. But another part of me was exhausted from fighting and just wanted this to be over. Attorney didn't push me either way. He said it was my decision and he'd support whatever I chose. I told him I needed time to think about it and he said that was fine. I spent the next few days turning it over in my mind. A trial could drag on for years. There was no guarantee we'd win or that I'd get more money back. The plea deal meant certain payments even if they were smaller than what was stolen. I talked to my roommate about it and she said sometimes getting something with certainty is better than risking everything for a maybe. That made sense, but it still felt like letting Aunt off easy. I called attorney back after talking to my mom about the plea deal. Mom said she understood both sides, but thought the structured plan might be better than years of uncertainty. She pointed out that a trial would be expensive and emotionally draining for everyone. I'd have to testify and relive everything in front of a courtroom. Aunt's lawyer would try to make me look bad or greedy. The whole thing could tear the family apart even more than it already was. Mom wasn't saying I should let Aunt get away with anything. She was just being realistic about what a trial would cost me personally. I thought about everything I'd been through already. The Thanksgiving dinner, the emergency hearings, the criminal charges, the newspaper article, the fractured family relationships. How much more did I want to put myself through for the possibility of a bigger judgment that might never get paid anyway? I called attorney and told him I wouldn't oppose the plea deal as long as certain conditions were met. The plan had to be legally enforceable with real consequences if Aunt missed payments. The payments had to be regular and documented. There had to be interest to account for the time value of the money she stole. Attorney said those were all reasonable conditions, and he'd work with Danielle to make sure they were included. He reminded me this didn't mean I was weak, or that Aunt was getting away with anything. It meant I was being smart about protecting my interests and choosing the path that gave me the best chance of actually recovering money. I agreed to the deal and signed the paperwork attorney sent over. It felt like closing a chapter even though the story wasn't completely over yet. Aunt would still have to make those payments for years. I'd still have to deal with the family fallout. But at least I'd have some certainty about what came next, and I could start moving forward with my life. A few weeks later, I drove to the cemetery on a Saturday morning when frost still covered the grass. I parked near the section where my grandmother was buried and walked over to her headstone with my hands shoved in my jacket pockets. The cold bit at my face, but I sat down on the ground next to her grave anyway and started talking like she could hear me. I told her about the Thanksgiving dinner and how Aunt tried to make me look greedy in front of everyone. I explained how attorney found the sealed letter she left and how it saved me from losing everything. My voice cracked when I thanked her for being smart enough to see this coming and protecting me even after she died. I promised her I would use the money for college like she wanted and not waste it on stupid stuff. Sitting there talking to a headstone probably looked weird to anyone walking by, but I needed to tell her everything that happened. I stayed for almost an hour before the cold got too bad, and I had to leave. Driving home, I felt lighter somehow, like I had closed a chapter by sharing the whole story with her. 2 days later, I got an email from Becca saying the first restitution payment posted to the estate account. I logged into the portal she set up and stared at the number on the screen. $5,000 from Aunt's account, exactly like the plea agreement required. It was such a small amount compared to the $400,000 she stole, but seeing actual money come back felt real in a way the court orders and legal documents never did. Becca's email confirmed the payment cleared and said the next one was scheduled for the following month. I took a screenshot and saved it in a folder on my phone labeled Progress, because I needed proof this was actually happening. The family group chat stayed a mess after everything came out. Some relatives still defended Aunt and said I should have been more patient or handled things privately. Others sent me private messages apologizing for not believing me sooner and admitting they knew Aunt had money problems for years. I stopped trying to fix things with people who made excuses for what she did. My circle got smaller, but the people still in it actually had my back instead of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Mom and I talked more honestly now, and my cousin checked in on me every few weeks. That was enough. 6 months after that terrible Thanksgiving dinner, I sat in my apartment looking at my paid tuition receipt and current rent balance. The inheritance ended up being around $250,000 after legal fees, and what could be recovered from Aunt's assets. It was way less than the $600,000 my grandmother left me, but I had a plan for finishing college and starting my life without drowning in debt. My family was messier than I wanted, and some relationships would probably never recover, but I stood up for myself when it mattered most. I fought back against someone who tried to steal my future, and I won the important battle even if I lost some money along the way. Sitting there with my laptop open and bills organized in folders, I felt proud of how I handled everything. I think my grandmother would be proud too. And that's the full story. I love when a simple moment turns into something we can actually learn from. If this one gave you even a small shift in perspective, then it did its job. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.